I now call to order the Planning Commission meeting for November 10th, 2022 for the city of Newberg, Oregon. Faye, may I have a roll call, please?
Chris Wright,
Here.
Sharon Capri,
Here.
Jeffrey Mishal,
Here.
Jason Dale,
Here.
Linda Newton Curtis.
Yeah.
I would like to open public comments for this items not on tonight's agenda. If any. Faye, is there anybody in the waiting room?
Nope.
All right.
Madam
here.
Chair, I do have a comment.
Okay.
So I'd like to introduce our new planning manager,
Oh, yeah.
Clay Downing. He's been with us almost 3 weeks tomorrow, which is a holiday. Yep.
It's nice to meet everybody. My name's Clay Downing. I've been just relocated up from Oxnard, California, and I'm really looking forward to working with everyone. So thank you.
And we have Mary Heberling Crichton with us tonight because she's going to be working on the housing production strategy. So
Yay.
faces you don't get to see very often or you haven't seen before.
I know. I think this is one of the first times a few of us have actually met in person. This will be our first time.
The other piece is that the city is recruiting for its boards and commissions and committees. So there's a flyer sitting on the table. So they're in that process now. They've extended the deadline to December 2nd. It's on the council schedule to review that information and make nominations, appointments, I should say, on December 19th. So right now, Charles Aben stepped down, Connor Hansen stepped down, and our student commissioner position is vacant. So in order to have a valid and legal public hearing, we had to have all 5 of you. 5 is your quorum.
That makes sense. I was wondering about that.
That's all I had.
All right, thank you, Doug. I will be closing public comment at this time. All right, moving on to the consent calendar. Do I have a motion to approve Planning Commission meeting minutes for October 13th, 2022?
I would like to move that we accept those.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Motion to approve October 13th, 2022. May I have a voice vote, please? All of those in favor say yay or aye. Aye. Any nays? Thank you. Planning Commission meeting minutes pass 5-0. Next, we have a quasi judicial public hearing. A call to order the November 10th, 2022 quasi judicial public hearing for CUP 22-0012 DR 222-0009 located at 5. Oh, I have that wrong. Is it 530 or 503? 530? Okay, East Edwards Drive, telecommunications equipment. The purpose of the Planning Commission is to review the application, hear and discuss public testimony, deliberate facts and findings, make a motion in the matter, and then vote. Testifying procedure will be owner or applicant or any primary opponents have 15 minutes, and then the first proponent or second undecided or opponents have 5 minutes. After each speaker, the Planning Commission may ask questions for clarification. At the end, the owner applicant has a chance for rebuttal. At this time, I would like to call for any abstentions, bias, ex parte contact, or objections to jurisdiction. Hearing none, may we have a legal announcement for Luba Red?
ORS 197-797 requires certain statements be made at the commencement of a public hearing. The applicable city and state zoning criteria must be listed. This means we must advise you of the standards that must be satisfied by the applicant prior to our approval of an application. The planning staff will list the applicable criteria during his or her presentation of the staff report. Persons wishing to participate in this hearing must direct their testimony or the evidence toward the criteria stated by the planner or other specific city or state criteria which you believe apply. You must tell us why the testimony or evidence relates to the criteria. Any issue which might be raised in an appeal of this case to the Land Use Board of Appeals, LUBA, must be raised in person or by letter at the local level prior to the city approving or denying the application. The law states that the issue must be raised in enough detail to afford the decision maker and the parties an opportunity to respond. This part of the law is known as the raise it or waive it requirement. If you do not bring it up now, you cannot bring it up at LUBA. Failure of the applicant to raise constitutional or other issues relating to proposed conditions of approval in enough detail to allow the local government or its designee to respond to the issue precludes action for damages in circuit court. Prior to the conclusion of the initial evidentiary hearing on an application, any participant may request an opportunity to present additional evidence or testimony regarding the application. The Planning Commission will grant such a request through a continuance or extension of the record.
Thank you, Doug. At this time, do we have the applicant present?
We do, but we need to do the staff report first.
Okay. Then staff report and any of the commissioners may ask brief questions for clarification at that point. Thank you, Doug.
Sam Goodmestead, Assistant Planner. The case before you this evening is for telecommunications equipment at 530 East Edgewood Drive, and I will begin by entering the entire staff report into the record. Background: BlackRock Consulting, on behalf of Verizon Wireless, submitted an application to the city of Newberg for conditional use approval for new wireless telecommunications equipment housed within a faux church steeple. Again, its location is 530 East Edgewood Drive, and we have identified the map and tax lot number for this parcel. It is in the R1 zone, which is the low density residential zone, and the applicable criteria for this case is 15-220-050, which is the type 2 design review criteria, 15-225-060, which is the conditional use criteria through a type 3 process, 15-445-180, which is the telecommunications facilities criteria, and 15-445-220, which is the installation standards. This is some information about the property. Again, it is in the R1 zone and the current land use is a church. This is a map identifying the location of the property. It is on East Edgewood Drive and it is the area bordered by blue. This is a site view of the property. This is the proposed site plan. And these are their proposed elevations. The design review criteria, 15-220-050. These are dealing with things like design compatibility, landscaping, and zoning district compliance. Telecommunications facilities require a type 2 design review and is a conditional use in the R1 zone if incorporated into the existing structure and is 18 feet or less in height. The faux steeple will be architecturally compatible with the existing building and is within the height limitations of the alternative building height standards. There's existing landscaping on site and no parking is proposed to be added. The conditional use criteria, 15-225-060, is dealing with location, size, design, and operating characteristics. The proposed antennas and associated equipment will be enclosed within a faux steeple and will be compatible with the architecture of the church. It is an unmanned facility and will be visited approximately once a month by a technician. There will be no increased traffic because of the proposed equipment, and the facility will not disrupt the existing residential characteristics of the neighborhood. Subsection B is dealing with location, design, and site planning, and then C is whether it will be consistent with the code. So a quick summary, which is further detailed in your staff report. The location provides a functional improvement and capacity improvements in coverage for Verizon Wireless. The steeple design is compatible with the church architecture and will not detract from the residential character of the neighborhood. Telecommunications facilities criteria 15-445-180. These deal with visual impacts and effect on surrounding residential areas. The proposed equipment at 530 East Edgewood Drive is not a new tower. The visual impact to surrounding area will be minimized by the faux steeple and ground screening. Installation standards. 15-445-220. The applicant was required to demonstrate that no existing tower can accommodate the proposed antenna equipment. The nearest tower is too far away to serve the intended coverage area. Additional tower operators were also contacted. The applicant has made a good faith effort to demonstrate that existing towers cannot accommodate the proposed project. Staff's recommendation is that the Planning Commission adopt Order 2022-014 with conditions, approving design review and conditional use permit DR 222-0009, CUP 22-0012. And that will conclude staff's presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. It was an excellent presentation. At this time, is the applicant available? For the record, can you go ahead and state your name?
Thank you, Chair Wright, members of the commission. My name is Mike Connors. I'm with the law firm Hathaway Larson LLP. Do you want address or does okay, we don't need the address. I'll go ahead and let you.
And I'm Sophia Meckers with BlackRock Consulting.
And Sophia is the one that prepared and submitted the application on behalf of Verizon. I'm legal counsel's represented Verizon for a number of years, and I'll be handling the bulk of the presentation, but may defer to Ms. Meckers for some details, depending on whether you have any questions. So this is the second time that Verizon has proposed this particular wireless communications facility in the city of Newberg. In 2017, we filed the same application, same design, same property, same code. The code hadn't changed, hasn't changed since 2017. Went before the Planning Commission, got unanimous approval. There's no opposition, no appeal. So we had our final approval. But because of budgetary operational issues, the construction of the project got delayed. And then we discovered that the approval can't be extended and it expired. So essentially the application that's before you denied is in essence a reapplication of what we applied for and got approval for in 2017. As I indicated, the current proposal is virtually identical to the proposal that was approved in 2017 with one exception, and that is it relates to the generator. The 2017 application included a generator. The current proposal does not include a generator, includes a generator plug. And what is meant by that is the generator is there in the event of an emergency and there's a power outage to be able to keep the facility running so that people can still have coverage to be able to make calls, et cetera, which as you can imagine is very important in an emergency. But a lot of times people have concerns about the generator because of noise impacts. And so in this case, with the generator plug, what that means is that we can bring in a temporary generator if needed, plug it in, and then during that emergency, be able to ensure that we still have power, can provide service without having the impact that goes along with a permanent generator because you have to run tests on a periodic basis. The application material inadvertently, I think because of the 2017 made reference to a generator. Someone noted that and we realized that was a mistake. We corrected that. And this last week, we submitted a revised site plan to reflect the current proposal, which is no generator, just the generator plug. Other than that generator, the proposal's the same as the one in 2017. It includes a stealth design, a faux FRP, fiberglass reinforced plastic steeple on the roof ridge of the church building, and it will match the exterior architecture, finish, and color. So it will look blend in with the existing church structure that's out there. And the steeple will essentially house the antennas on the inside, and that's the main purpose. Is to a lot of people have concerns about wireless facilities, visual impact. They look too utilitarian in nature. So the antennas are inside the steeple and will be enclosed and obscured from view from the surrounding properties. It won't be, the steeple's no closer than 100 feet from the closest residential area, and other, that's to the south, and other directions is far more than that. So there's quite a bit of setback distance. And then there'll be some ground equipment that's in an equipment cabinet, which will be on the southern facing side of the structure, the existing church building. And it'll be enclosed with a 7-foot wood fence. And then there's lots of vegetation on the southern boundary of the property. There's some pretty dense, tall hedges in there that will obscure that equipment area from surrounding properties. The purpose for this facility is it's both a coverage and capacity facility. Coverage is something that we all sort of understand. There's certain areas signal can only go so far. So if you have these gaps in coverage, you'll have weak signals, drop calls, et cetera. Capacity really relates to the volume of data. And when the existing systems get overloaded, it can have a similar effect as a coverage a coverage gap. Because if it gets overloaded, then you get that weak signal, drop calls, et cetera. And so this particular facility is both designed to deal with the coverage gap, and that's the area that is north of East Mountain View Drive, I think it is. And and then the capacity to help offload the existing towers in the area, because they're already at capacity. And so once you get to overload, you get into those kind of issues. And, as I think we all know nowadays, wireless is crucial to all of us. We have all our different devices. We use it for calls, we use it for emails, we use it for internet, we use it for streaming. So this is intended to ensure that that northern area of the city of Newberg has adequate coverage, at least for Verizon customers. So that's a little bit of background, just kind of addressing the key criteria. So telecommunication facilities that are incorporated into an existing structure and that are no taller than 18 feet above that existing structure are allowed as conditional uses in all residential zones, including R1. And so in this case, the steeple is 18 feet taller than the existing structure, so it'll be at a maximum height of 54 feet 2 inches. And there's a couple of different height related issues. One is in your code in section 15415030, there's an actual exemption for this kind of facility, which is sort of these rooftop type structures that aren't, the whole structure, but like roof, chimneys. They even talk about towers, similar kind of structure. So it's exempt from the baseline zone height restriction. But in addition to that, the code allows for an alternative height analysis, and it's at the applicant's selection. And under the alternative height analysis, the overall height of the structure is limited as 89 feet. And in this case, again, we're at 54 feet 2 inches, so well below that maximum height. And although there aren't any specific visual impact standards in your telecommunications section of your code, at least none that apply to this type of facility, some that relate to a tower, but this isn't a tower, it's a co-location. We did, propose the steeple because we recognize that's a big concern for a lot of people in the surrounding area, the visual impact, and to try to blend it in. And, I've been doing this a long time. There's a bunch of different stealth type options. I will tell you, this is one of the optimal ones. You see a lot of the faux trees, which can be really good from afar, but when you're up close, it looks more obvious. If you can have a stealth option that is integrated into an existing building, that's really the optimal option, at least from my standpoint, because it really does serve its purpose of blending in and obscuring sort of the typical utility like visual impact that you see on a lot of these facilities. So also complies with all the design and development standards. The design of the steeple is compatible with the existing structure, will match the existing architecture, finish, color, as I said earlier. Setback requirement, the R1 zone is 15-foot front yard setback. Here, the minimum setbacks 100 feet from any of the adjoining properties. Landscaping requirements 15%. Here, the existing landscaping on the property already is at 65%. So it's well in excess of the minimum standard. And as I indicated, there's a tall, dense sort of hedge on that southern property where that's closest to where the facility is going to be located. That will provide quite a bit of screening there. Traffic parking, very minimal, essentially one trip per month. Somebody go out there and do a test. I know there's not very many uses that are one trip per month, are there? So in this case, negligible traffic. There's 108 existing parking spaces on site, so obviously more than sufficient. And then if you look at the telecommunication requirements in chapter 15.445, most of them apply to new towers, but we sort of addressed them and showed, to the extent that they're not applicable, explain why, and to some, even when they're not applicable, demonstrate that, we're consistent or comply with that. One of the ones that does apply in our case is to demonstrate, Sam made a reference to it, to demonstrate that there are no existing towers in the area that can meet the coverage and capacity objectives of this tower. And so we provided a RF usage and justification report that examines that, looked at the three closest towers. The closest one is on Alice Way. The RF engineering looked at that, took a look at that, and indicated that it doesn't serve the main objective here of providing that coverage and capacity to that residential area to the north. And then there are two other towers that we looked at that are further from Alice Way, located on Lincoln Street as well as Douglas Avenue. Neither of those work really for two reasons. One, they're too far away because they're even further away from than the Alice Way tower. But also they're too close to existing Verizon facilities. So that creates interference. And when you have interference, it's similar to kind of the gap that I talked about. And for most carriers, it's much easier and cheaper to be able to co-locate on a tower because there's not as much permitting process. There's not as much cost as it is to, build a faux steeple on top of the church. But, in this case, none of the existing towers or towers in that close area would work. And so that's why we're proposing what we're proposing. So based on all that, we're requesting that you approve the application subject to staff's recommended conditions of approval. We've reviewed the conditions of approval. We're fine with all of them. As I indicated earlier, that, planning commission, I know there have been some changes from this commission, but the previous planning commission did approve it in 2017. We really do think that, like I said earlier, this is the optimal kind of proposal or design because it's a stealth that really is going to be the highest level of stealth in terms of serving that purpose. And as you know, city staff reviewed the more recent application. They agreed it complies and then proposed the conditions of approval. And so with that, that concludes my presentation, unless you have anything to add. And we can take any questions that you may have at this time.
Any commissioners have any questions?
So this is probably a really stupid question, and I'm sure there must be code about it, but I'm wondering, I agree with you. I love my cell phone and my computer and internet and all that stuff. I'm on it all the time. But I'm wondering, you were talking about the generator and the fact that it won't be on site. And so I was wondering, well, if we did have an emergency, then how long would it take to get a generator to the church? And where would it come from? I mean, I'm sure you've thought about this. And so I just thought, like I say, a really quirky question.
I don't know all of the particulars to that question. Obviously, with the idea of having a temporary, we're going to want to make sure that is readily available. And so I think I can give you some assurance that will be readily available, because if it wasn't, then it wouldn't serve any purpose whatsoever. I don't know the particulars about where it comes from, and I don't know if you have any particular information on that.
Verizon does have an office in Portland where I'm sure that they store some of these emergency generators. They, of course, would be notified if there was an outage. There's battery backup power that would power the facility for a little while until they could bring a generator in. It's not as though it would just go down, but they would do everything possible to keep that site on air.
Can I ask a follow-up question? So actually within the church, there's some kind of backup system that would power it for a limited amount of time? Is that what you're saying?
I think it's within our equipment cabinets themselves. Our equipment has batteries. The generators there, once the batteries are use up all of their power to provide some supplemental power at that point. And that's a really good point. I should have led with that there is battery backup that's part of standard equipment that allows for some amount of power. So it wouldn't be as though there's an emergency and suddenly the facility is down immediately. So it
Yeah.
does provide some time to bring the emergency generator.
That gives me a lot of assurance, I have to say. That makes me feel very happy. And then the other thing I was wondering about, and maybe this is a question for you, Doug, is earthquakes, because we're in an earthquake zone. And so I was wondering about our codes for new construction at that height in terms of earthquakes and that kind of thing.
Because this is a faux steeple going onto a structure, they have to get a building permit. So
Sure.
through that process, our plans examiner would look at it because we're in a seismic 3 zone, I believe. So it's not something that the planning commission looks at, but the building staff will look at that. And hopefully we don't have an earthquake.
Mr. Wright. Yeah, Linda, in their report, they do talk about the guide wires and other stuff that they'll be using to stabilize it due to high winds and a couple other things.
Yeah, I read that. I just thought I'd ask.
It's a fair question.
And yeah, in a 10-minute subduction zone earthquake, we'll see what's standing afterwards.
Yeah.
Actually, one of the other things that I have done during my career was the tsunami routes, but thank you very much. Any additional questions from any commissioners? Hey, is there anybody waiting in lobby or anything like that for any comments, questions?
There is, but they don't have their hand raised or anything.
Okay, just maybe here for something else. To the two gentlemen that are here in the back, are you for this hearing? All right, thank you. Hearing none, we'll be closing public testimony for this portion of the hearing. Any final comments from staff and recommendation, please?
No final comments. Thank you.
Planning commissioners?
Concern is the emissions. There's a house, there are neighborhood of houses.
Yeah, sure. Mike's not on.
Sorry. My only concern is the emissions from the tower based on the fact that you have residential homes right up against this one side of the church. I think it's a fabulous disguise. I mean, it's really well thought out. My only concern is in each of those little houses, there might be little children and I'm going through the emission diagrams and it doesn't look like, I mean, you've got 100% to 1,000% up close to the church. The red is 1,000% plus. I'm not real used to how much emissions these do get. I've just been always dubious that it doesn't affect the people right up close to it. I know we have to have towers and this is a great disguise, but is there any study that shows long-term what happens to neighbors that are right up close to them?
So, Madam Chair, if if the commissioner is looking at a question for the applicant, you'll need to reopen the testimony portion.
Oh,
At this time, I'll reopen public testimony for the applicants. Go ahead, Commissioner Capri.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to respond to that, and thank you for your question. I was hoping I would at least get a chance to answer it. So there has been extensive studies that have looked into RF emissions, health and safety related issues, and what is deemed to be safe in terms of, proximity to the towers. And the FCC is the agency, the federal agency that went through a very elaborate, extensive rulemaking process where they essentially say, we're looking at these RF emission issues. They sent out, inquiries from all different interest groups, all different government bodies, and then scientific information along with that, reviewed that data, and then based on that, established national RF emission standards. And that's important because you have these national wireless companies that are designing their facilities for a national type system. And so if you have all these different standards and different thresholds, it makes it impossible to do. And again, given how important wireless communication has become in our society, you need to have a system that will be able to have sort of uniform requirements. So the FCC establishes the RF emission standards. Part of our requirement from a federal level, and there's also a condition related to it in the code, is that we have to demonstrate compliance with those standards. And, the emission standards come up a lot. I get it. I understand the concern. There's all sorts of things that we live with day to day that, you assume are safe, but then you kind of wonder. But because it's a national uniform standard, Congress actually passed something under the Federal Telecommunications Act that basically determined under federal law, the FCC is the exclusive agency that establishes these standards. And as part of the Federal Telecommunication Act, they basically indicated, and I know this is sometimes hard to hear, but local jurisdictions are prohibited from using RF emissions or concerns about health or safety bases on that. I understand you may disagree with that, and that's a fair argument. I'm just telling you what the federal standards are. And then if you look at your code, because understanding that the city council sets policy, there's two things in your code that are important to understand. One is your code specifically allows wireless facilities in residential areas. In fact, all the zones through conditional use. And for most of them, you have to have some kind of co-location, meaning you can't just go out and do a tower, but that was part of a policy decision that your city council made to allow that. And then if you look at your code standards, to the extent that it refers to RF emissions, again, it references the FCC standards and the requirement that that be the case. So again, I understand that there can be differences of opinion and there can be valid reasons to question it. But as you know, as a planning commission, your job, your duty is to evaluate our application based on the standards. And so it's not just the federal law that's saying, hey, you can't look at that, but it's your own code itself that says it's okay in residential areas. There's no additional, we're well outside any kind of setback that would be required. And to the extent the RF emissions are an issue, it's demonstrating compliance with those FCC. So I apologize for the lengthy explanation, but I always like to give a lengthy explanation because this is an issue that comes up, and I know that where it's coming from.
I appreciate that. Thank you for your answer. I think we went over that when we were talking about 5G about a year or so ago. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, Commissioner, we did talk about the 5G a couple of years ago now.
Yeah.
Couple of years ago, yeah.
I wonder if I can ask a follow-up question just for my own education. What are the standards and I understand the code and I understand what our point of being here is, but do you happen to know what the federal standards are and what the emissions are going to be from this tower?
I don't recall the specifics of the standard because the standards really aren't just like one number standard. They're really a proximity to where you would have people congregating. I don't know if you know offhand the specific, I don't know all the data. And part of the reason we don't know it is because it's not really something that comes up in the local permitting stuff. It comes up in the federal. And if we had our Verizon federal compliance people here, they'd be able to, give you every specific answer. But I just don't know all the particulars and would not feel comfortable trying to kind of guess my way through it because I don't think I'd be educating you. I might be confusing.
Yeah, I'm sure I can Google
But
it.
but the key, yeah, you can. But the key to understand is that there are these FCC standards. They're uniform, so they apply across the country, and we're required as part of our federal compliance, part of this proposal to demonstrate that we comply with it. I can say this, that I've been doing this for a number of years for Verizon, and in terms of where we are in the emission standards, it's a fraction of the maximum standard. Like if you want any assurance, it's not as if the FCC standards here and we're at 90%. It's like 1-2% below that threshold for most of these facilities. To the extent there's any kind of emission issue, it's more with like maintenance people that are closer proximity to the antennas and making sure that there's adequate separation in those regards. But in terms of us living in our houses and our business below, it's well below what the FCC maximum emissions are.
That's good information. Thank you.
Okay, I appreciate you giving me that charitable since I couldn't answer your specific question, but hopefully that gets to your concern. I don't know that offhand. Do you know? I don't.
And you know why this wavelength is stronger as it travels through the distance?
I don't. I'm not a RF engineer, so I don't know the science. Welcome.
At this time, do any of the other commissioners, we're still deliberating? We're in deliberation still. Are there any other comments, concerns, questions?
I'm all in favor of the Santana. It complies with all of our regulations and it's stealthy, as the applicants have said, and it sounds like God's getting more bars. So I'm happy with it.
I love it.
And if I could add just a bit here, as far, and I like the word you used, optimal, because this does sound like an optimal, everybody wins kind of situation on this. But to throw something out on the emissions, the FCC and emissions in general, we have some of the most restrictive in the world. And that's why, if you look at like airlines, I've been in the airline business prior, and even the cell phone communications on board, they do tend to err on the side of caution for the most part. So I'm not too worried about the emissions, even with the homes relatively nearby, because so many studies, like you said, have been done where there's been nothing that can be nailed down going anywhere for it. So I'm comfortable in supporting the proposal as is. It does sound like a good way to put a tower there and hide it.
Any other comments, questions?
Madam Chair, I move that we accept CUP 22-0012. Or approved, I should say.
I second.
Okay, we have a first and a second to approve conditional use permit CUP 012 and design review 222-0009 for wireless telecommunication facility and ground equipment. May we have a roll call vote, please?
Chris Wright,
Yes.
Sharon Capri,
Yes.
Jeffrey Musall,
Yes.
Jason Dale,
Yes.
Linda Newton Curtis.
Yes.
Thank you, commissioners. Planning Commission Order 2022-014, order approving conditional use permit CUP 22-0012 and DR 22-0009, a wireless telecommunication facility and ground equipment, including attachments or exhibits A and B. Has passed. Congratulations. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. You have a great evening. Thank you. And at this time, we will have housing production strategy update from Mary Herberling Creighton, our wonderful housing planner.
Thank you. It's nice to finally see a lot of you in person. Seeing you on the screen, now it's in person, so this is fun. I won't be doing most of the talking today. We have our consultant with Echo Northwest, Beth Goodman, who will be doing most of the presentation. But I will give you a brief introduction here about the housing production strategy. You've all had a very, very rough introduction a while ago when we were about to start the housing production strategy, but we've been meeting with the advisory committee, who is the Affordable Housing Commission. They've had 4 meetings now, and so this is kind of an update for you all on where we've been in those 4 meetings. And then Beth will also do a little brief reintroduction of what the housing production strategy is as well. Any questions right now for me?
Hi, Beth.
Hey there, how y'all doing?
Perfect. All right, Beth, go for it.
Okay, thank you very much. And Madam Chair, I assume that you'll interrupt me as there are questions in the room, please.
Okay.
Um,
Commissioners, keep track of slide numbers, so go back as needed. If needed.
and I'm happy to answer questions as we go along. So here we are, we're working on a housing production strategy. And in brief, what it is, it's an 8-year action plan. And so this is a plan that will be executed over 8 years. And we're trying to narrow down on the right actions, right being defined by discussion with our committee, as well as feedback from other people. Right strategies that the city should implement over the next 8 years. These aren't going to be strategies that we know all of the details for implementing them right now, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But these are going to be things that are essentially identified as things that the city should be doing. And when I say should, I mean, I'm not the person giving the normative to this. This is the discussion of our committees and the stakeholders that were engaging in this. So the housing production strategy, it builds on information we have from the housing needs analysis and provides more information about what Newberg's future housing need is going to be. We work with stakeholder engagement from this project, as well as from past projects, to make sure that we're understanding housing need in Newberg. And we'll talk a lot of detail in a few minutes about what housing need means. We've looked at a lot of different strategies, a lot of different actions that we could include in this plan, and are narrowing down on the actions to include. At the end of the project, we'll be evaluating all actions, all strategies, to ensure that what we're achieving in the end is fair and equitable housing outcomes. That results in the housing production strategy report. And then you do the hard work of implementing it over the next 8 years. The HPS is directly connected to the housing needs analysis, which we worked on together over the last few years. And I believe that staff had presented you with the final draft analysis. That focuses on buildable lands inventory and a forecast of new housing, provides us a lot of information about housing affordability. The housing production strategy refines that understanding of housing need, focusing on incomes and costs of housing, so housing affordability. It looks at gaps in existing policies, so that implies that we look at the existing policies that the city has, like a construction excise tax, and identifies potential strategies for inclusion and does this evaluation of all the strategies we're talking about. So the housing needs analysis was really, in a lot of ways, about land with information about affordability. The housing production strategy considers land and land use related actions somewhat, but it focuses more on affordability issues. As Mary said, we've been working on this for a little while. We've had 4 meetings with our citizen committee, and we'll be having another one with a draft strategy in February. They've helped us develop a list of, I forget exactly how many are on the list, somewhere between 10 and 15 actions that are appropriate for Newberg to address the current conditions in Newberg, based on what you're already doing, because you're already doing quite a lot. So just to talk for, weren't there any questions?
No, go ahead.
Just to talk for a few moments about housing need. Always as a reminder, when you think about housing need, one way of measuring it is looking at the percentage of income that a household spends on housing. So that's referred to as cost burdened. A household that is said to be cost burdened spends 30% or more of their income on housing. So what we're looking at right here is something that shows cost burden within Newberg. Sorry, I was just looking for the overall cost burden rate, and I don't have that right here, but it shows cost burden by income level for renter households and owner households. So what you see is a little bit of what you'd expect. Households that are income below $35,000 are much more likely to be cost burdened, especially for households who rent. What you see is that about 94% or so of renter households with income below $35,000 are cost burdened. Those with incomes below $20,000, 81% of renters are severely cost burdened. So they're paying 50% or more of their income on housing costs. You can see why this is an issue. This is an issue up through middle income households, not just lower income households. But we are looking here a little more information at lower income households. Renters are substantially more frequently cost burdened in Newberg and in almost every other community in Oregon than homeowners are. So if we think about housing affordability based on income, what we're looking at here is something that shows the median family income for a family of 4 in Yamhill County at $96,900. That's a standard set by HUD. And for a household of 4 that has that income, they can afford about $2,420 a month in rent. When we look at your 2-bedroom rental costs in Newberg in 2022, about $1,700 a month in rent. When you include utilities in there, selected utilities like heat and electricity. So a household would have to earn about $68,000 to afford that, or about 70% of median family income for a family of 4 in the county to be able to afford that. So all housing that's more expensive than that isn't affordable to that household. And of course, you've got a fair bit of housing, rental housing, that is more expensive than that. So as we consider development of new housing, I think it's useful to think about who builds new housing and what is it affordable at. So when you talk about low income housing, you're often speaking about income restricted housing. So housing that's affordable to a household that earns 60% or less of median family income. This is housing that when it's built, it has typically federal money in it, state money. You might have heard of low income housing tax credits. It's got that kind of thing in it to help finance it. Well, when we look at a household that earns about 50% of median family income, they can afford about $1,200 a month in rent. You can see how if there's no housing that's affordable to those households, they end up being cost burden, which is certainly what's happening in Newberg and what's happening across cities across Oregon. So the people who are going to build housing that's affordable in this income range are typically nonprofit developers, your housing authority. It's people who are building this income restricted housing. Another group of housing types is housing that's affordable to low and middle income households. So that's typically about 60% of median family income, certainly up to 80% of median family income, and sometimes up to 120%. So at 80% of median family income, you can afford a rent of about $1,900. That's a little higher than multifamily rent in Newberg. This kind of housing is developed by private developers. A lot of the time, newly built housing that is say multifamily is not going to come in as low as $1,700. It's going to have higher rent than that because it's newly built and costs a lot of money to build new housing. So developers who build housing that's affordable in this low and middle income range oftentimes can't do it and be financially feasible because the rents they can achieve are too low. In other words, people can't afford to pay the rents for newly built multifamily housing that's in that middle income level. You might also refer to that income level as workforce housing. I resist the term workforce housing as much as I can because workforce housing often refers to housing that's affordable between 60 and 120% of median family income. And people who are earning that oftentimes do work, but also people who are earning less than 60% of median family income also work. So workforce housing is also this lower income housing. So for instance, a nursing assistant may earn $37,000, a cashier an average of about $30,000, a construction worker about $44,000. So on their own, they certainly can't afford market rate housing. And then you look at newly built housing, it's oftentimes newly built that is affordable to this income range up here, above 120% of median family income. So the median sales price for new and existing housing in Newberg is about $443,000. A household would have to earn $126,000 or 131% of median family income to afford these prices. And newly built housing is oftentimes newly built single family housing is oftentimes more expensive than the median. So when we look at your distribution of incomes of household by these income groups, what we see is a sizable portion of your households that have income below $48,000. And this is not publicly subsidized income restricted housing affordability group. And then also a sizable number that have income between $48,000 and $116,000. This is your middle income group, oftentimes referred to as workforce housing, and then a smaller share that have income above $116,000. These numbers here represent the number of existing households in dark blue and the forecast of new households in the teal color. So this is information that comes out of your housing needs analysis. Before I go on and talk more about housing affordability and housing needs, are there any questions about the last few slides?
None, Ms. Goodman. Thank
Okay.
you.
Certainly, thank you. So we just talked about housing need based on income. You can also look at housing needs based on different groups of people. So first, you've got people experiencing homelessness. They typically have very low income or no income. Their housing needs are first of all for shelter, and then beyond that, more permanently supportive housing. So that can be housing that is both affordable and may have some services attached to it to help them remain in housing. Some people who are experiencing homelessness don't need those services, so it's just the affordable housing. For all of these groups that I'm going to talk about, there's need for housing without discrimination. And so that gets at issues related to federal fair housing law, of which time there's often a lot of discrimination for the groups we'll talk about here. So then you've got people of color. What their need is for housing is, of course, affordable. People of color, on average, have higher rates of cost burden than the average in Newberg. So they're more likely to have trouble affording housing. They're also more likely to have a lower household income, which is why they have trouble affording housing. And then again, need for access to housing without discrimination. People 65 years and older and people with disabilities, I'll group them together because some of their housing needs are similar. So again, you've got higher rates of cost burden among seniors and people with disability, oftentimes lower incomes. Need for housing is a little different. You might need housing that is physically accessible, say, for people with physical disabilities, like a wide doorway or a ramp. Again, you need access to housing without discrimination. And some people over 65 and some people with disabilities also need access to certain services as part of their housing, like opportunities for in-home health care and other various types of services. So as we're working through the housing production strategy, we're keeping all of this in mind. These different needs that aren't directly connected only with income.
Ms. Goodman,
Yes, ma'am.
is this based on the homeless counts? Is this for adults only?
This is for adults only. We have in our report information about homeless students in the school district. So we have that information as well. Well, this isn't actually adults only. This is people who are sheltered and unsheltered. I went straight to the school district data. So this is different than the school district data, which we also have.
Okay, so this will be a combination of the minor data from the state of Oregon, including the adult population data.
Yep, this is the
Okay.
information about people who are sheltered and unsheltered and counted in the point in time count. Will also include information from the McKinney-Vento school data.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
You referred a couple times to discrimination,
Mm-hmm.
and I would like to know if you're referring to active discrimination based on, I don't know, the homeless shelters discriminating against people, or are you referring to disparate impact?
Well, both actually.
It's difficult to believe that there's homeless shelters out there turning away people based on their skin color.
Well, I was going to go and say I wasn't talking specifically about homeless shelters. I was talking about things like ability to get a bank loan, willingness from landlords to rent to different groups of people. Those kind of discrimination are really what I had in mind. I hadn't thought about a homeless shelter turning away a person of color.
I again find it difficult to believe that there's much of any of that going on because it immediately make national news in the political climate we have today.
I'm not actually asserting anything about homeless shelters.
I'm sorry?
I'm not asserting anything about homeless shelters.
I'm not asserting it right now either. You mentioned
Okay.
Banks and other places,
Mhm.
that sort of thing. I mean, I've never heard anything local about anybody discriminating based on skin color ever. So I don't know why that would be included in this.
There's well documented evidence that banks systematically discriminate in lending practices. That's one example of a type of
Is it
discrimination.
discrimination or disparate impacts? Those are two different things. One's actionable legally, the other is not.
I don't really think that I'm necessarily trying to differentiate between the two of the within your question.
Very well.
I'm wondering if I can ask a question. Can you define disparate impact for me?
Disparate impact is impact based on race or ethnicity or this based upon so it would be these people are experiencing different outcomes and they're in different groups, but it's nothing due to actively saying, okay, I'm trying to produce this impact. It's happening.
Okay, I see what
You-
you're saying. I
got it,
understand. Yeah, totally.
Thank
I
you,
think it's a
Commissioners.
question of intent.
Thank you, Ms. Goodman. Continue, please.
Certainly. So in developing the housing production strategies, we're paying attention to the fact that there's a lot of players in affordable housing development. And if you take affordable housing development as a broad thing, everybody needs access at one level or another to affordable housing. So you've got the federal and the state government who have certain roles. County and housing authorities have different roles, oftentimes using federal and state funding. Developers and nonprofit agencies have different roles in affordable housing development. And then cities have a role oftentimes around things like land use regulations, developing infrastructure, having certain programs that can support affordable housing development. So we are focused here on the city of Newberg and looking at the city's specific role in housing development. So where you see where housing development can occur, it's where you've got land that has the right public policy as well as infrastructure to it. So you've got land that's vacant that has services like water and wastewater and transportation that is zoned in a way to allow enough density to allow development. The design requirements are such that development can also go forward and allow a developer to build a profitable project. You have to have access to capital. So the developer has to be able to get construction loans, that kind of thing. And also there must be market feasibility. So you have to have high enough rents and sales prices to pay for the cost of developing that housing and supporting a profitable project. And of course, here we're talking about private development, less than nonprofit development. Well, the city has obviously a direct role to play in public policy in land and infrastructure pieces. Cities rarely have a big role to play in availability of capital. And they have a limited ability to affect market feasibility through things like property tax exemptions, that kind of things on very specific instances. It's a power a city must use selectively to support development of the type that meets the community's goals. So as we're talking about different actions, realize that actions that are more impactful tend to involve access to some resources. So if there's public land that can be used to support development of housing, if there's funding that's allocated to support development of housing or development of infrastructure to support housing, on down to the less impactful side of producing informational resources or partnering to leverage efforts and resources. Those things are very important, but in and of themselves, they rarely result in development of new housing without other different types of actions, of strategies to support them. Usually when you see development of new affordable housing or new workforce affordable housing, it's several different layers of actions, several different types of policies that is supporting that kind of development. It's important to remember that there's requirements for the housing production strategy. This is meeting a state requirement for producing a housing production strategy. For the strategies, the actions identified in the final HPS, the city's committed to implementing them. That doesn't mean that the city will successfully implement it, but committed to trying to implement it. It may well be that there is some strategy that's included in the HPS that when the city looks at it further, it finds that it's not feasible to implement for whatever reason. At that point, the city would look for other actions to address the need that is under discussion and use some alternative action. And then the city also is required to update the state, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, on implementation progress of the HPS and commenting on the effectiveness of the policies in the future and when the city does on its next HPS. So remember that strategies that aren't identified in the HPS can of course be implemented by the city, but the city is not held to specific action for those strategies that aren't in the HPS. That's just another way of saying, if you don't include it, but in 2 years, it looks like a really good strategy, the city can do it. The city could amend its HPS and include it in the HPS at that point, or the city can do it without it being in the HPS, and that's okay also. So we've talked to a number of stakeholders about the strategies we're proposing here in the HPS. So some developers, some service providers, a few elected officials, some nonprofits. And what we've been hearing from the developers about the strategies proposed. So when we're looking at income restricted housing, so that's the most affordable housing, the type of help that they're saying is most helpful is things like waivers of system development charges or other fee reductions, priority for permitting, availability of infrastructure, so making that sure that there's water and wastewater and transportation infrastructure near. Those are always going to be very important things. Looking at, are there opportunities for donating land to income restricted housing? That's certainly something that a lot of other communities around Oregon do when there's publicly owned land and it is identified as surplus. Can that be put in to support affordable housing? And then don't just think about the large projects, but also think about what smaller projects what you can do to help the smaller projects also. So looking at things like density bonuses, and density bonuses are where you allow greater density than is typically allowed under the existing zoning, especially for affordable housing or housing that's otherwise meeting some city goal. Of course, we recommend that the city should be strategic about where this is allowed and when this is allowed and for what it's allowed. Land banking, maybe working with a land trust. So a land bank is where the city may contribute land into an official land bank, or the city could maintain a land bank of its own. That's a little bit less formal than a formal land bank. But again, that's where you do things like identify land that is publicly owned and surplus to need. So one of the recommendations is about maintaining a land inventory. And that could also include an inventory of land that faith-based organizations where they want to see on their own land development of affordable housing, but they may need partners in supporting that development. So I'm going to skip through some more of the rest of these because there's quite a lot here. When we talk to service providers, what they were talking about is, of course, changes in different demographics are affecting them. So they're seeing more single people, more people who are chronically homeless, and more people who need rental assistance. So are there opportunities for the city to help in some way with resource sharing and connecting different partners together? They noted that there's no incentive for landlords to work with people accessing programs. So there's housing choice vouchers that can't be used because a lot of the time rents are higher than is permissible with the housing choice vouchers. This is a problem amongst many of our cities. And there's need for more upstream resources that are beyond what the city does, but like state resources for rental assistance and eviction prevention. As we're thinking about the HPS, we're thinking about these different actions and groupings. So one grouping is supporting development of low and moderate income affordable rental housing. That's your workforce housing. Increasing opportunities for development for affordable home ownership. So how do you get households that have low income and perhaps sometimes very low income into home ownership? That's definitely a challenge. Encouraging development of income restricted affordable housing. And preservation of low and moderate income affordable housing. So what we've got here is all of the different actions that are making it into the strategy at this point. And what we specifically would like to talk to you all about is the strategy around preservation of manufactured home parks, providing density bonuses to support development of affordable housing, and considering restrictions on and conducting inspections of short-term rentals. Those are the actions that are most closely touching on things that the Planning Commission is directly involved with. And I'll come back to this slide in just a few moments. But we're looking for your comments on these strategies. And do you have any concerns about them? Do you have suggestions for things that we might consider more deeply in them? And I can walk through these strategies if you'd like me to, or it may well be that you guys have a sense of them because from what you read from us.
Can you leave that slide up just for a little bit so we can look at it?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. I assume you're towards the end of your presentation.
Yes, I was going to ask if you'd like a little more description of several of these things, the three that we've
Right.
the three that we've held out.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Commissioner Wright, Ms. Goodman. According to Oregon law in 2014, chapter 89.5, there's already issues for sales. If a manufactured dwelling park is going to be put up for sale, there has to be written notice of intent to sell to the residents first, et cetera, et cetera. And
Yeah.
I think based on some of the laws already currently surrounding manufactured dwelling parks, that the city of Newberg does need to add a zone for manufactured home parks. That if otherwise they're always going to be at risk for being removed and redone.
And so you could create a zone that is, I'll just say, called manufactured home park zone. You don't have to create that zone, but you could, and then you could zone your 8 manufactured home parks with that zone. And that is what a number of different cities have done to protect their existing manufactured home parks from redevelopment.
Yeah, I know we have a high amount of.
Madam Chair, I might just
Go ahead.
a point of clarification. So we do have a thing called an R4 zone. You look at our zoning map, you don't see it anywhere, but we do have that zone, and that is for manufactured home parks.
Ah, thank you, Doug. So you could apply that zone to your 8 manufactured home parks or some number of your manufactured home parks. Are any other types of development allowed in that zone other than manufactured home parks?
I'd have to go back and look, Beth, but it's
Okay.
focused on manufactured home parks. It's never been.
Okay,
Well, there you go.
there you go.
Ahead of your time.
It would take conversations with the property owners.
Our existing, I'm sorry if you
No.
said, our existing manufactured home parks aren't under R4?
No, most of them are under an R2, medium density residential.
And is there any benefit to be gained from rezoning some of the existing?
I think part of that would be, would there need to be revisions to the provisions of the R4 zone if you're trying to protect? And so tonight we're just trying to glean what your ideas are. There's and if it ends up in the HPS, then there's an implementing step to all of this.
Well, you're right. And to decide that, we need a little more details.
Yeah.
Mhm. Another approach to preservation of manufactured home parks is something that's been happening across Oregon. About 30 manufactured home parks have been preserved through different nonprofits assisting the existing residents of the manufactured home parks in buying them. And so in that instance, the city might play a convening role in this. In other words, help with making sure that there's connections between the existing residents and any nonprofit that's doing this, and help make sure that those discussions happen. But the city has a less direct role in that. But that's something that's certainly happening, and is a very effective way to preserve existing manufactured home parks for the people who have housing in them. So we can look up and answer your question about the R4 zone and whether it would require any changes to that zone in order to apply that zone.
Beth, what does STR stand for on the bottom? option there?
Short-term rentals.
Short-term rental, thank you.
Yes. Do you want to talk about short-term rentals for a few moments?
Sure.
And I think Mary has a little bit more of this information in her head than I might have in my head. But the city has a limited number of short-term rentals. I think about 40 of them that are known, that have gone through the approval process or are currently in the approval process. And the city defines short-term rentals as both bed and breakfasts and things like vacation rentals. Short-term rentals are only allowed in single-family housing in residential zones. There are already existing requirements for off-street parking, limited on number of people allowed during a rental period. And the housing must meet the standards of the building code for overnight sleeping facilities. So you could do things like implement inspections of the existing housing for short-term rentals. That's certainly something that some cities have done so that they're, sure that they're aware of the short-term rentals and that the short-term rentals are in the condition expected for allowing that kind of rental. Some cities also do a certain amount of restriction on short-term rentals. You have some of that in allowing them only in single-family residential zones. But if you had concentrations of short-term rentals, which you don't currently, that I know of, but you could consider setting a maximum percentage of units or tax lots citywide that can be short-term rental. You could allow the limit the number of short-term rentals, say by neighborhood or citywide. You can set a minimum distance, between short-term rentals. There's lots of different ways to restrict short-term rentals and regulate those. A lot of the time, there's two different reasons for doing this. One, short-term rentals, in some cases do take housing out of the market for long-term rentals. Of course, there are some people who have second homes who rent their housing. And if it's not in short-term rentals, it would just stand vacant. So in that case, the housing wouldn't be available for long-term rentals. And then you've got quality of life issues. Some communities have a lot of short-term rentals, say, concentrated in certain places, and that can disrupt the neighborhood. So these are the kind of things that are under discussion around short-term rentals.
This may be a Doug question, but wouldn't inspections fall under the similar office as code enforcement?
And we're severely lacking under that department if my information is correct and things are still as they are, so. It would be dependent on if there was a restructuring of our vacation rental regulations. It could land that the community development department does the inspections rather than the code enforcement. Well, sure, but I'm thinking of it purely from a manpower perspective, whether it's under code enforcement or there you're spending the money at the city level to make sure that that's happening, you know? I think there are two options. One, those inspections could rest in the planning division, or it could go to code enforcement. We're working on getting a code enforcement person at this time, but there's a lot of work to do on code enforcement, from fences to garbage to chickens to all kinds of things.
So if we were looking at it from the perspective of code enforcement, then would we be trying to identify those houses that hadn't been submitted for review? Is that what that would be about, or would it be different? I mean, I guess,
I
I'm sorry.
think that would need to, there need to be a discussion to try to define that. Because right now is that short-term rentals come before the planning commission for a public hearing for their conditional use, to use a single family home as a short-term rental operation. We have an RR3 zone, those do not come to the planning commission. But it still has to be in a single family home. So we have seen an uptick in the last 2 years or so of those kinds of applications. You've seen it. I've got a spreadsheet, and so it's kind of been up, but we've seen this in pandemic times. We've seen an increase in that. We have a map that shows where these are located, and they're concentrated immediately north of downtown and south of downtown. We're now starting to see a few that are starting to get out further, some up to the north. So as Beth has said, different communities have taken different approaches. Some is just a cap that you have, some have a distance separation. And I'm sure that there are others that we have looked at as potential opportunities. The commission has talked about this on a number of occasions recently. We talked with the city council back in March, and they directed us to do some more research on possibilities of what a program might look like, or elements that might be included in that. I think that the concern that we've been hearing or been coming back to staff is it's taking long-term housing opportunities out of the pool. Given the fact that Oregon has a housing crisis, and we, as Beth has shown you data tonight, we have our own set of housing issues that are here. But on the other side, we also have a portion of our economy is the tourist economy. And so it's balancing those things, those policy choices, what can be done, what should you do? So that's why in part, and Beth, correct me if I get too far off, is, that's why we wanted to have this conversation. You have brought it up, council has brought it up, because it does have an impact on our housing stock.
And so the action is really dive more deeply into this issue and determine whether any sort of restrictions or an inspection or any of those kind of things are necessary. And it may well be that at this point, the city determines it's not necessary, and that's okay. Or it may be that the city decides that some sort of action is necessary, and that's also okay. But all of the details of this and what should you do and what might you do, those are all things that would be worked out in this action during the implementation of it. This is why this is an 8-year action plan, because there's a lot of different things to put through a public process.
Commissioner Wright, there is a wonderful site for all the commissioners here that is out of Washington called the MRSC.org. It's the Municipal Research and Service Center for the state of Washington. And it has a bunch of examples here, at least 10. I'm going to read just a couple to you. They cite the city, Pulsbo. It's in,
Hillsborough.
thank you, it's
It's
in
up,
Washington.
by, just past Bremerton. Just
Okay.
north.
In their code, they have an ADU may not be used as a short-term rental and must be rented for a minimum of 90 days. To whereas, opposite of that, a single family, okay, Awaco's municipal code reads, single family residential zone is only permitted single family, but then the ADU is the only one allowed for a short-term rental. So they give a
That's
bunch of options here.
That's interesting.
So, yeah,
I was just reading on California and their ADU codes are
Yeah.
all over the place.
But you,
like,
otherwise we can't record your lovely comments.
might, but might.
So for instance, Hood River only allows short-term rentals when you've got the homeowner living in the house and they're renting out a room, for instance. That's one of the only situations in which they allow short-term rentals. There's a lot of different options.
And yeah, there's a lot in here. Plus they give some out-of-state examples. So I would recommend hopefully to, I will go ahead and give this URL to Faye and Doug, so we can spread it around and everybody can really look through these codes. And Washington State is close to us. They have a like geology, infrastructure, housing, and they're just similar to us. And it would be a good idea to go and look at some of those things. And then when we come to the city later on this year or next year, when these things are done, is it possible to have the city give us an a la carte menu to choose from, or have option A, B, C in codes that we come up with for that particular session? Does that sound feasible?
Yeah,
to go
Commissioner, you
through
saw here too, and just a follow-up with Doug though. What do you see just you know, from your own perspective as far as going forward? Are these, or a lot of these still coming down the pike? Vacation rentals, or are we at a leveling off point, or?
We've had an application submitted for another one. That's coming.
Cause I don't see, I mean, you know, we are tourist oriented, but we're not like Polsbo, you know, we're not like right on the water and everything. I don't see that we have to be nearing a saturation point at some point here.
And then I can't
Don't
tell
see
you
it
what
coming
that
yet.
saturation point
Yeah.
is. You know, if you think back of the ones that we've done over the last couple of years, some of them have been out of state owners purchasing that they're using it when they're here visiting their children at the university. We've had some that they've purchased because they eventually want to relocate here. We've had others that have done it more as kind of an investment property, and they've looked at it as a short-term basis was better for them than doing a long-term rental option. So it's across the board.
I know it would be hard to quantify, but I'm just wondering how much of it's pandemic related. You know?
And that's a variable. It's hard, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we kind of seen an uptick during the pandemic. Things were kind of steady before then, and then we saw this blip go up.
I'll offer my worthless opinion or 2 cents, but I don't necessarily think it's a pandemic thing. I think it is an a investment thing, a both real estate and stock market thing. People are seeing the volatility in a lot of that stuff, and they see real estate as much more stable. And so they're looking for a place to put their money, and that's been a good option. And as Doug was just saying, short-term rentals often do better as an investment than long-term rentals. Like you look at people doing, Airbnb and stuff, and they can get as much in a month out of 2 weekends of rentals than they could renting it long-term rental for the month. So that at that point, they've paid their mortgage, and then anything they might get on top of that is gravy. And so they're looking at that. And now with the economy and the stock market turning back the other way, and real estate possibly entering a deflationary cycle, the market may make it entirely moot with vacation rentals. So
Commissioner Wright, according to the economics of the state of Oregon, the state of Oregon is in a boom because of migratory people coming here from other states. That's, believe it or not, that's how the state, yeah, cities, it's building, and with the state, it's infrastructure, because this was a question I had to talk about recently. And I was very surprised how the state of Oregon perceived economic, its economics. So,
you mean the state government?
yeah, state government viewed our economy, and the biggest factor was, do we have people moving here? And apparently we do, and a lot, relocating from other places.
In-migration has been a driver of Oregon since the 90s at least. I haven't gone back and looked much before that. But something like 2/3 of Oregon's growth is from people moving here from someplace else.
I moved here from someplace else.
It's shocking. Mary, would you happen to have an idea about a threshold for what they were talking about, a threshold rate of saturation for rentals versus short-term rental availability?
I mean, what other cities are capping kind of their,
Here in Newberg, the amount of rentals
Oh.
available versus like long-term rentals versus
Mhm.
short-term rentals.
yeah, I don't have that off the top of my head. Beth, do you have that relatively available?
Well, if you give me a moment or two and you ignore the fact that something's going to pop up on my screen, and just give me a moment, you've got a lot more long-term rentals than you do short-term rentals. I can state that unequivocally. You know of 40 of them, so let's just start there. And let's see, for tenure, in 20, there we go. You've got about 2,800 renter occupied units and about 5,300 owner occupied units. So 2,800 or so that are renter occupied units, and then there'll be some amount of units that are vacant because they're in between being rented. But that's also not a large number. So you've got a relatively small share of rentals, housing right now that is in short-term rentals that you know about. And even if it's twice that amount, it's still a relatively small share.
All right, thank you very much. Ms.
Can I
Green.
ask a quick question? How do you identify the houses that are in long-term rentals or that are long-term rentals?
This is information from the census. The American Community Survey surveys households and asks, are you renting your house or do you own it?
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Mhm. Do you want to talk about the third item here, the density bonus?
We sure can.
Sure.
So the idea with the density bonus is, say you want to support development of income restricted housing. Maybe that's a community priority. or a community priority is development of workforce affordable housing. And here we're usually talking, well, historically, we've usually been talking about multifamily housing that's like apartments. But it could be missing middle housing. That's an interesting question there. So it could be any of those types. But essentially your zone, say it allows, and I'm making up numbers because I can work with these numbers, a maximum of 20 dwelling units an acre. Well, you could have a density bonus that applies, say, in an entire zone, or maybe it applies in a geography of a zone, like only in this part of downtown or in this overlay zone. So you can target this to a particular area, and you say for that area, if you're developing housing that's affordable at these price points, and you have to define this clearly, in that case, you can develop instead at, say, 30 dwelling units an acre, rather than 20. So you're giving a bonus to what's already allowed, and allowing more development of housing may allow development of more smaller units. You have to consider things like parking ratios and landscaping requirements and all of that, how that balances out in this, to make sure that what you're trying to incentivize is something that is theoretically possible. That combined with other types of support for housing development can sometimes get you development of housing that is just not possible in other circumstances. It's not financially feasible. So what you're trying to do here is you're trying to make something that isn't financially feasible more financially feasible. And in deciding if you're going to allow density bonuses, there's a fair bit of work you have to do here in deciding what areas, under what conditions, for what kind of affordable housing. These are all things that would have to be worked out in development of this action. So this is one tool among many. And again, oftentimes you get, many tools stacked on top of each other. And that's where you can get housing that just isn't otherwise plausible to develop in the existing housing market, because it's not financially feasible.
It seems to me we'd have to be really careful if we went that route, because when you think about high density, I don't know, historically, it seems that when there's been high density areas, that has also led to some increases in crime and violence in some instances. And I'm not saying that that would necessarily happen here, which is why I'm saying we'd have to think about it very carefully. But it's also in some instances also led to the development, I think, of slum areas. Again, I'm not saying that it would happen in Newberg, but I am saying that I think we'd have to think very carefully about what we meant by high density and how that was configured.
And you might look at an area where the city is working on improvements already, where this would work particularly well with it. So in your urban renewal area, for instance, if you had some more opportunities for a little bit more dense development, then you have more people living in the area where you're trying to get businesses to grow and thrive also. So there are ways to do this where it's building on other things that you're doing that is particularly helpful. And I would certainly assert that you should be trying to target this in a way so that you get a mixture of incomes. Quite frankly, as Doug can attest to, because I know he's been talking to different developers about something recently, looking for opportunities for workforce housing development, it's sometimes hard to get developers to do this kind of housing because it's not financially feasible. So even if you allow some amount of density bonus in selected areas, that doesn't necessarily mean that without a lot of other push, you're going to get much housing developed. A lot of these things have to stack on top of each other.
A lot of it comes down to that capital stack.
It is that capital stack, exactly. How you make it financially feasible.
Commissioner Wright, the city of Orlando, Florida does things like, when a developer has a certified affordable housing development, they pay the impact fee when they
Mhm.
pull the building permits, but then the impact or fees are then reimbursed when it's certified that they have low income qualified certified people living in there. Then they get it reimbursed back. Now, is that something that would be available with the city? Or do they really need those?
We have a version of that in here. It's reduced system development charges, which are equivalent to impact fees for income restricted affordable housing. So that's a version of the same sort of thing as one of the strategies, one of the actions in the draft HPS.
And another thing that was come up, Mary, have you guys ever talked about, in the city of Los Angeles, they have a housing certification that would go by like your board, and if it qualifies, they get a certification, but when it comes to the city, their projects have priority for pulling permits and everything else over others. Is that anything that CAC has talked about?
Well, Beth, correct me if I'm right here. There was talk about quickening permit review process. Is that right, Beth? And we moved
There
it.
was.
We moved it from an action to a recommendation. Is that correct?
I believe we did. It just didn't seem to make that big a difference in what we were talking about. Because of course, in Los Angeles, you don't have the same kind of requirements that development review happen over a certain period of time. Here in Oregon, we've got the 120-day rule. In California, I don't believe they have that. And so I imagine that development review times in Los Angeles are really different.
Yeah. Yeah, I just tried to look up the cities with the most populations and stuff like that, and get to see how long-term they dealt with it. Because some of these were not large population centers to begin with.
Am I aware of a city or some cities who give an advancement going through the permitting process? Yes. So is it feasible to do? Yes. Again, it's something that, we have to look at what the logistics of all of that would mean. If you've got one project that's come in, doesn't have any affordable housing in it, other project comes in and it's much smaller, let's take 100-unit complex versus 20, can you advance that smaller project just to get through that process quicker? Is it feasible to do? Yes. Then you've got the other project going, well, why did this project get advanced in front of mine? I was in the queue first. And so again, these things we're going to have to talk through. There's no specific answer this evening, but trying to get what your questions are, your ideas.
Beth, do you mind if I switch down to the support application of fair housing laws line?
Mhm.
Because when I hear fair housing laws, I've conjure some connotations of some bad stuff. And I'm wondering what all that means.
So these are federal fair housing laws. And so what are the city's options for supporting those fair housing laws? Well, you could adopt a policy, for instance, that says that you'll affirmatively further fair housing. You could have staff trained by something like the Fair Housing Council of Oregon about fair housing laws, so they have more information about fair housing laws. You could have the same organization offer training to people who live in Newberg, to tenants, to landlords. I think there's a lot of nuance in federal fair housing law that I think people don't necessarily know about and know their rights. And so these are different ways to help people learn more about their rights. And perhaps for landlords to make sure that they're not inadvertently or on purpose violating fair housing laws.
Sure, but what are the fair housing laws saying that you're referring to? Because I'm not familiar with them.
Wow, fair housing is a pretty complicated set of law that I couldn't really summarize. I'm not an expert in fair housing. But essentially it's saying that you can't discriminate based on things like race, religion, I want to say source of income. There's a whole set of protected classes. I know that age comes into this, disability comes into it, so on and so forth. And what does it mean to abide by fair housing laws? Well, I happen to remember, this is a funny sort of thing, but I happen to remember working in Omaha at one point, and one of the communities around the Omaha area, their counter didn't have any their like planning counter didn't have any accommodations for people with disabilities, so people in wheelchairs. Another community got a fair housing violation because in order to rent a unit anywhere in the city, you had to go to the police to apply for a rental application. And that was a violation of fair housing laws. There are a whole range of other things, but it's honestly a complicated set of federal regulations.
Well, I guess I just don't understand then, because if you can't particularly summarize something, how are we supposed to support application of it? I mean.
Well,
and
I'm
all-
saying that I don't
all the
have the
situations
words.
You just raised, I mean, there's nothing like that in Newberg. We don't have those issues. If people are having those problems, I mean, they're gonna sue somebody. So I just.
I don't have the words available right now because I'm not a specialist in fair housing. Doug may well know a little bit more about fair housing and be prepared to give you a summary. I could give you a summary if I took a little bit of time to prepare it.
If I could offer a little bit too, I think they break down primarily into two categories. You have like the single landlord, or, sometimes, like you say, inadvertently not knowing the rules or just blatantly ignoring them. But then you have the institutional side of the fair housing laws, where you get
Mhm.
like redlining and things like that.
Right.
So you have to think of them kind of two separate like entities, both kind of sit to address the same kind of problems, but not necessarily lumped together.
So if you'd like to know a little bit more about fair housing laws and the sorts of protections in therein, you might look at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. They have a lot of information on their website and a lot of educational information. I'm sure we could bring you back some information at a later point.
We've had ongoing conversations with the Fair Housing Council. They've offered to come do trainings to educate people. When we get federal CDBG money that comes through, we have documents we have to comply with the fair
Yeah, I'm
housing.
sure you are.
And fair housing laws. And so every time we've gotten these grants to do repairs to manufactured housing, there's reams of paper that we have to read through and understand and agree that we're going to do these things. So from my perspective, this one, for me, and I'm only one voice, it's about educating. It's about educating landlords and it's about educating tenants. And then as we go through and we're doing, construction excise tax, and we're trying to do affordable housing, we've got contracts that we're going to have to deal with, and we need to make sure that we're abiding by the federal fair housing laws. And so Beth, in part, is correct. It's this big thing, But for me, it comes back to education, education, education.
And also defining how we're going to educate, because I think
There's
that's so
different ways.
important. Yeah.
Okay, that makes more sense to me then.
Okay.
Yeah, I was thinking about something you said, Beth, when we were talking about the density and how you mentioned it would be good to have a variety of income levels within the same area rather than just low income or high density in one area. And it brings to mind in Wilsonville, actually, there's an area called Villebois, and
Yes.
they have some really nice houses and some really, from the outside at least, they look like some beautiful townhouses that are high density, but I know I always go back to the aesthetics, but they look so nice. And I think one of the things that always worries me about high density, as I said before, you know, some of the things that can occur because of having a high density, but it's also the quality of life of the people that live in these high density areas. And I think we have to think about that so carefully.
I agree. One of my colleagues lives in Villebois, which is why I smiled so much. And I remember when it was first being developed. Another place you might look at, which is a very different thing than that, is Arinco Station in Hillsborough. It has a really interesting mix of different housing types. It's a higher density than Villebois, and I'm not suggesting Arinco Station for Newberg, because among other things, you're not on the max line. But what one of my colleagues who used to be the development staff in Beaverton really advocates for is when you're doing new income restricted housing, can you get something that's more mixed income housing right next to it? We have that. I happen to live in Eugene, and so right near my office is 5th Street Market, and we just had a big new development that is genuinely big for Eugene. That is market rate apartments, and then right next to it, right next to the building I'm in right now, is income restricted affordable housing. And so right in this little, block and a half area, or 1 block area, you do have that mixture of incomes. And that's pretty important to maintain throughout the community. It's why, say, if you do duplexes on the corner lots or within other single family developments, then you allow opportunities for people who rent as well as people who own. That's sort of an old theme, an old timey sort of theme that is more relevant now today again, of course. It's the same kind of ideas.
So Beth, I would share with the commission, remember that our highest density, our target is 16.5 dwelling units per acre.
It's not
very high density.
not very high
Not
density.
very high. Beth and I worked on the HNA. It's not. So when you think about it, think about the apartments that are on Fernwood and Springbrook apartments, or if you go to Chehalem Point, both of those are developed in an R3, and they're pretty close to that 16.5 dwelling units per acre. They're 3-story suburban walk-up apartment complexes. We're not talking about 7-story buildings and 40 or 50 dwelling units per acre. Our current regulations don't have that. So when we're talking about some density bonuses, is we have some provisions. If you're in a stream corridor, you can transfer some of that density out. But if we're talking about, income restricted or affordable housing, instead of, and the market is telling us, developers keep coming to me, we need to get to, 22 to 25 dwelling units per acre. And I'd say, we just have a target. It's not a cap. If you can meet all the other design requirements for parking and your landscaping and your shared outdoor areas and so forth, maybe you can get to that particular density. So you've got these market forces trying to push it up. So, one possibility is if you got an R3, can you get, with some density bonuses, can you get to 20? You're still in there, it's a 3-story building.
Mhm. Yeah. I
But
get
then there's
that.
some of that trade-off then, if you do that, is there any trade-off in the reduction of some of your open space areas? And so we're doing a separate project. Well, with the code audit, you're involved in that. And so we're looking.
Coming next week to you about it.
17. So, we're talking about those kinds of things. So there's some intertwining between the HPS and the code, multifamily code audit program.
So I have something that may be useful for Linda for a couple of the concerns you've mentioned. And so the one instance I can think of and that is an instance of a project that was income restricted since I've been on the commission. I think Doug, you were here for this one, was the one on Meridian. You remember this one?
That was a housing authority, Desk and Commons.
Right, and yes, Desk and Commons, thank you. And it may be useful to track some of the statistics that have gone on, surrounding that development for crime, like you mentioned that before, if any, what the surrounding community thinks of it, all the impacts that income restricted development has had. And whether it's a good thing, whether we need more of it, based upon that particular thing happening. I mean, it was because it was completely a new development, and I think 2014 or something like this, 13, I forget exactly when.
It was just before I got here, it was about 14.
Yeah, and it was not, it's relatively speaking, a nice place for what it is, because we as a commission at the time toured it as it was done. It's like, oh, okay, this, this is what it looks like. And so it may be useful to use that as some kind of barometer for this sort of thing happening in the future.
Exactly.
That's helpful. Yeah. No, I'm not making any inferences about if you're low income, then,
No. I know you.
Yeah.
But to see, because sorry. It's one thing to say, okay, we want to do, excuse me for the right term, income restricted housing. But it's another thing to say, okay, we've done this wonderful thing. Well, have we? You need to go back and check to see what's happened. So.
Yeah, no, that's good.
So I'd like to be respectful of your time. I think we've probably gone a little longer than an hour. Are there other comments that you have on this? Any other guidance, questions, concerns? I can also go on answering questions till I'm blue in the face.
I think out of your list there on this particular slide, I like supporting preservation of manufactured home parks the best. Density bonuses, assuming we can figure out what that is and entails and everything, and the reduction of SDCs. The land bank, I don't know. But those three jump out at me pretty well.
And let me see. The land bank is really we should have renamed it here. That's really changed to looking at an opportunity for supporting development of market rate affordable housing. And this is working with the Newberg Workforce Housing Consortium. So as we've done more work with that group, as in talk to them more as they've been getting their concepts together more, we've refined that one quite a bit. So that one's really focused on opportunities to work with that group.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ms. Goodman.
Certainly.
Are there any other questions or from any commissioners at this time? Wonderful. All right, next we'll be moving on to items from staff. I know.
I don't have any.
I went back to the September or September 1. And coming up in December is December 8th, 2022 is Development Code amendment, substantial categories.
That's gonna get pushed back, and so the schedule is shifting and changing. You will have a subdivision that will be coming to you. And a conditional use for a vacation rental.
For December.
Yes.
Okay. And I noticed we have a water master plan amendment, water treatment plan.
That's getting shifted as well, so we've moved that into January.
Okay. Is that 2,400 something page document that we looked at? before?
You have, the commission has gone through the water master plan, then the amendments to the water master plan for the riverfront area. And now we're doing an amendment to incorporate the new groundwater treatment plant.
Groundwater. Okay, so it's not the water treatment plant, it's the groundwater.
Groundwater
Gotcha.
treatment.
All right, thank you. And I want to ask if the cities, well, originally January 12th, when we convene again, we would normally do an election for chair and vice chair, and we will be doing. But I was gonna ask if we could have short-term rental regulation or a workshop to do with our affordable housing STRs and things like that during that time. That might be that was before I knew, that was when it was blank. So,
Well, what do you want to do in a workshop?
go over laws and codes, maybe have a packet for everybody that has been read through, and when we get back here, then we can know or say, hey, we like this as a commission together, or throw those things out and you're gonna tell us why this is not feasible. Or
I
why it
would
is.
suggest that let staff try to find a date to do that, because you were talking about us doing research
Yeah.
and we've got
uh,
all of these other things, and where do I plug it in, and which staff gets,
Gotta go in the queue.
yeah,
Gotta go in the queue.
I mean,
Yes.
we know the commission has talked about it. It's been a topic of discussion a number of meetings now, but trying to say, come back with something on January 12th, in the middle of the holidays between Thanksgiving and Christmas and so forth.
Well,
Do all the
yeah.
research. I'm not sure that we have the capacity to do that.
And actually, yeah, it would actually not be a good idea, because we will have just the new commissioners as well as a new mayor coming on at that point. So everybody's got a lot on their plate.
So it's on our list to do the research. Council asked us to do it. Now you've asked us to do it. Clay and I will have to sit down and try to figure out the workload and how that gets woven in.
Alrighty. All right, at this time, are there any items from commissioners? Besides me, okay.
Sharon, you had something?
Oh, sorry, sorry. Totally apologize.
Okay, I was going back to last month when I suggested that we do some research on Second Street as making that more of an urban center, a little bit more of a place where people more park-like, a little bit, not a whole bunch, but have different amenities. And I kind of have been thinking about it back to my school days of urban design, and thinking, it'd be really cool if I could get kind of a master list from Doug and take it back to Portland State, to their urban design study program, and talk to the instructors, the professors, And maybe like we did in architecture, we would take it and do it as a term project.
They have capstones of Portland State in which they get students to do that. Because, I mean, grad students are always.
Yeah.
Oh, I apologize. I'll say that again. They have capstones at Portland State where they have the undergrads take a project
Yes.
and complete a project. And I mean, they do it as part of their class. But also the grad students are often very, very willing to, and Portland State's mantra is serve the community or serve the city or something along those lines. So I think that's a great idea.
Yeah,
I love
no,
that
and I
idea.
could, it really started really exciting me because I could see them coming up with something that would just like the cherry on top of this city. I love the riverfront development. I think I like up there by the Allison, all of that that's going on, that's going to be happening up there. This little strip of right behind downtown could be so very, very cool. It could attract so many people, both professionally and people that work here. It could be a wonderful thing. So I'm kind of excited about it, and I wanted to just run it by you guys and see if there was support in going forward.
Yes.
Am I understanding it correctly? You're proposing to college source, not crowdsource, but college source your design work to PCC?
Yep.
PSU.
PSU, excuse me. Interesting.
No, I mean, several of my program are my term projects in architecture. One was a homeless shelter for teenagers. And actually, as you know, you do all this prep work before you actually get into the project. And I was down at Pioneer Square interviewing homeless people. I found out about the different stats on homeless people. I found out about the kids within 15 minutes of them after running away, getting off a train or a bus. Within 15 minutes, if they weren't approached by someone who they could turn to, they had either a pimp or a drug dealer getting them. So, I mean, no, it was really big.
Oh, yeah, they stand there. They actually do.
So we did all that prep work, and then we went on to design a homeless place for teenagers, and it actually went in down by Lincoln High School. Not necessarily ours, but they did have one built. So this is kind of what I'm talking, you know, you could take it down there. They've got such creative people on staff, all the students, and to do something like this town, it would be just such a treat, I think, for them. And it would be something that we could present.
I mean, I think as a city, we have nothing to lose to get their ideas and their plans. It doesn't mean to say even that we have to approve it, but boy, I think it would be a wonderful idea.
Yeah, I
To
think
take it
just to get the creative juices going and to see what is possible.
there. Mhm.
Commissioner, right? Capstone is actually required at Portland State University to graduate. And yes, it is a very good resource. That's where I graduated from. Yeah, if you can get a professor in a classroom to take it on, they can. But Doug has already identified that Second Street has a huge overlay issue, some other stuff. So it might not work for this area, but it might work for a new upcoming area like the riverfront or by the Avalon. Yeah, by the Avalon, and it might be a more like a European walking community
Yeah,
within
I see,
distance and
that's what
close
I see.
proximity. That's what kind of the Aranco station. There were three study sites when I was at the university. Aranco Station was one of them, but the issue there was to try and have services located near residential, so you started driving less distances. You did certain sidewalks, green space areas within a huge development to promote walking, getting to your neighbors, having certain services there. And one out of the three were super successful in decreasing the average car drove over 26 miles less per week. And for 1 gallon of gas is 22 pounds of particulate emissions. Other than that, yeah, that
I can offer an interesting anecdote about the Allison area. So this year we've had 4 or maybe 5 separate times of people flying in just to go to the Allison. And there's a convention here in the summer sometime, and these guys flew up from Sacramento and I think the Bay Area. And then just this week, when we had the nice weather, there's a really nice retired couple that flies in from Prosser, Washington, which is, I believe, near Pasco, Tri-Cities. And they just, it's like, oh, it's a nice day, and fly in, and they have lunch at the restaurant and out. And so it's a much bigger, regional, maybe even national draw than you realize.
Oh,
And wouldn't it
my
be lovely
brother
for them
is
to
from
have a
Southern
beautiful walking
California,
area?
and they come up to
Well, it's
the
a little far to
Allison.
walk, but they go up there, they walk the trails.
Oh, yeah.
It's beautiful there, so.
Right, Commissioner Wright, and adding to that, the city of Aurora, the state airport is also going under things to expand, and they state that some of the people flying into there are also coming in to Newberg to stay here.
So Aurora is quite a different animal because airport wise, because they're much more industrial business, manufacturing, all that kind of thing there. They are the busiest airport in the state. They're busier than PDX. And it's where Vans Aircraft is, which is the largest kit plane manufacturer in the world. It's where Columbia Helicopters is, which does, worldwide, airlift, that sort of thing. There's 35 jets there. I mean, it's very, very different than, here. I'd be very surprised if they have much in the way of people actually flying in it as tourists there.
They
But
do. There's
yeah.
over 187,000 flight. I've been, yeah.
right.
If anybody can't get a hold of me, you know why? Because I'm next
Yeah.
to the airport. I can never get a signal there. Anyway, the other things I wanted to bring up were those huge documents. And I want to know if we can make a motion to limit the amount of pages to a planning commission at any planning commission meeting having up to 700 pages or more, that we need 2 weeks for planning commissioners to review. Over 1,000 pages, I would like 3 weeks to review. Over 1,500 pages, I would like 4 weeks. 2,000 pages, 6 weeks if possible. The development that was down by the Providence Hospital that we just did, that was, I don't know, you had to do an average of so many pages every day, including a couple of those. And I know we need to have time to look through those documents. I mean, I can do it. I'm retired though, and I don't have a lot going on at this time. So those things I can do, but it might be difficult for other planning commissioners or commissioners in the future to do those. And I know it's the
Not saying
nature
no,
of the
not saying
beast.
yes. I'm just letting you know that we have a 120-day shot clock. And we have to get through all reviews. So something that comes to you as a planning commission member, once we determine an application complete, we have to get through all the local hearing process and any appeals within 120 days. And so by, 6 weeks in advance, or 5 weeks in advance trying to get something, I'd have to really think through what does that do on the backside. On trying to meet that state statute requirement that we have to get through all of that. You know, I can apologize, you know, some of our applications are very large. You'll be getting one in 2023, which will be very large, very large.
Sorry.
Well, is there no way that you can parcel those out as you're progressing with a project?
You need to get the packet. So staff has done all of its analysis. So you have the application packet, however many pages that is. Then we get all the public comments that come in. We've got all the agency referral comments that come in. And staff between planning and engineering have to write the report. Again, I'm not saying yes, I'm not saying no. It's something I have to think about. So some of those timelines really, having something to you 5 weeks before a hearing. Because then it starts to play with when we go out for public comments, and there's a timeline for them to do that. And all of a sudden, they submit their stuff, and then, 6 or 7 weeks later, there's a hearing. And, will people try to submit stuff in the interim? Just I have to think through it.
And I do want to thank Ms. Fay Bates for, normally we were sent these packets on Sundays or the weekend, and we only had like 3 to 4 days before the hearing date. And that's changed recently, and I really thank you for that extra time. That's very appreciated. I have no further comments or anything from commissioners. Anything else? All right. At this time, Planning Commission meeting for November 10th, 2022 is adjourned.